Well, welcome everyone. It's good to be with you today. And this is going to be a fun webinar. It's all about getting your staff unstuck. Now, I don't know if we can really accomplish that in 45 minutes, but we're going to try to do our best. And what we've learned through the years is that just doing ministry, it's tough. I mean, we're engaging day after day after day. Sunday's always coming. We're in the whirlwind. Ministry doesn't stop. But we found a direct correlation between a church's health and performance of their church staff teams and the kingdom impact that their church is having. So today, we're going to be talking about developing a healthy and high-performing team because that's so critical to the execution of your church's mission. And joining me today, I have two good friends. First of all, let me introduce Lance Witt. Lance is the newest member of the Unstuck Group team. Lance is joining us with a lot of experience on this very topic, actually. He started Replenish Ministry, helping churches with soul care and individuals, pastors, teams with soul care. Spent a number of years with Saddleback Church as one of their executive pastors and teaching pastors. Lance, I am so glad not only that you're with us today, but that you're a part of our team now. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I love being part of the Unstuck group, and I'm excited to be on the team and excited to begin to help churches with this content around building healthy and high-performing teams. So thank you.
And with me, she's been on many webinars, and she's the co-host of the Unstuck Church podcast. It's Amy Anderson. Amy is our director of consulting at the Unstuck Group. And before that, she served at a great church in the Twin Cities, Eagle Brook Church, large church, number of different locations. And so Amy brings a lot of experience, not only in helping churches get unstuck and multi-site, but on this particular topic, she invests a lot of her focus helping churches thinking about staffing and structure and how to help church staff teams become healthier and high performing. So Amy, again, welcome to this webinar.
As always, so good to be here with the two of you. So thanks for having me.
And working behind the scenes, we have our team helping us. In fact, they're going to be taking live chat questions throughout our conversation, because at the end, we're going to come back and answer your questions. So as we're going through the content today, if there's anything that pops up and you want to hear a little bit more, just submit your question. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's webinar. And then if we can't answer all of them, we'll figure out another way to respond to your questions in the coming days. So with that, by the way, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit those questions. And if you love the social media and you want to live tweet this webinar, use hashtag UnstuckChurch, and all of your friends and family will be interested in what's happening in that conversation. But let's begin. Very first thing we want to look at is identifying the causes of team dysfunction. So here's what we found in working with church staff teams. They operate in one of two extremes. They get along with each other, but they struggle to execute plans, or they are impressively productive, but they're unhealthy and dysfunctional. So you probably have a good idea of which one of those your team leads toward. But Lance, I think I want to begin with you. Will you kick us off by talking about the tension between those two extremes? What's going on?
Yeah, well, I think the reality is, you talked about teams having a bent and a kind of a propensity, but I think the truth is, as leaders, we also have a bent, and every person on the team is bent toward one side of this equation or the other. And so I think it does set up a tension, because on the health side, you've got churches that I would say suffer from what I tend to call terminal niceness. Like they're very polite. They present this sort of veneer of unity. They don't disagree in meetings. But sometimes what happens out in the hallway and the one-on-one conversations after the meeting, it's what I call the church version of trash talking. And these churches also often don't deal well with conflict. We tend to not hold people very accountable. And so again, great people love to get along well, but struggle maybe on some of the performance side. Well, then you flip to the other side of the equation. You have teams with a really strong culture of focusing on results. They love talking about goals. They read every latest leadership book. They throw around the word metrics a lot, but sometimes unintentionally, they can sort of trample people in the process, and relationships get injured and people don't feel valued or invested in. And then they can begin to feel as though ministry is more transactional than personal. And so I think because of those two realities always bumping up against each other, it does create this tension.
Hey, Lance, this is a curveball, but you're the newest person on the team. What do you think the bent is at the Unstuck group?
I would say my initial assessment would be, if I look at the organization, the bent is on the high performance side. But I would say, having gotten to know the team, it is very strong relationally. So I think there is a good blend, but I would say you guys have been helping churches get unstuck and get clear about metrics and vital signs and actually making kingdom progress, which tilts a little maybe on the performance side.
Yeah. Okay, I appreciate your honesty
That
there.
was a curveball. Thanks.
Hey, Amy, again, I mentioned earlier, you're working almost weekly with churches in the Unstuck process with this focus on staffing and structure. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I see with teams that have this high focus on health, often there's some event or issue that has happened in the background where they have been a very toxic team for whatever reason. And I see sometimes they actually overcorrect in this area. So maybe there was a dysfunctional leader, like you mentioned, Lance, who was so focused on metrics or performance at kind of any expense that when that person left, there's been an overcorrection in that place. In fact, I was recently at a church like this, and while the health's been restored for many years, they really are a team that loves one another. They're also wise enough to know we really haven't gotten a lot accomplished in these last few years as we've been trying to heal relationally. On the other hand, when performance is really the lead in these two, I actually get a lot at multi-site churches because often the teams are overextended, meaning they're now in multiple locations. Everyone is working so hard, but because there's a tangle in those lanes of who owns what, who's doing what, there's dual roles, triple roles. I see a lot of multi-site churches where the teams are really just exhausted and the relationships are feeling that. There's a lot of strain in them. And because it's always Sunday, there's really no time to address the pains that are emerging. So really, when a team is focused on another, I guess that's the point of this podcast. It's actually the mission that suffers, either way.
Lance, sometimes the issue is fairly obvious. The symptoms are obvious, but the root cause may be hidden. Why is it you think that churches don't deal with it?
Yeah, I think first, maybe though, it might be helpful just to say sometimes I think it's not obvious for some of kind of what we've already talked about, that again, sometimes we get so focused on doing church, prepping sermons, pulling off the weekend, as we sometimes talk about the whirlwind, that we don't really stop to go, how well are we doing at doing teams? And I think sometimes, like the senior pastor, especially depending on personality, sides of the church, can maybe be a bit removed and isolated from really digging down. But when you talk about underlying causes, I'll just use myself as an example. When I was a senior pastor, I would say one of the underlying causes of our lack of team health and performance was my own insecurity. My own insecurity, people pleasing, that got in the way sometimes of really addressing issues and addressing some of the broken stuff in our staff culture. And so people pleasing and fear of conflict, all those things kept some things unhealthy. And I remember there was a moment when we had to let a youth pastor go, and it was a really painful experience. And we asked him, we sent him to some counseling with his wife, and we said, would it be okay if your counselor came back to us and helped us learn how to better do these kinds of situations? And when the counselor came back to us, he said, you know what the problem was? He never heard you. And it just reminded me of Susan Scott in her book, Fierce Conversation. She talks about sometimes the message gets lost because we put so many pillows around it. And that's where I was as a leader. And I just wasn't clear. And I think sometimes we have to go back to who we are as senior leaders, the bent that we have, and then also the issue of our own emotional health. And so there could be a lot of underlying root causes, but I think we always want to start with, where am I in this? And what is my perspective? Because as a senior leader, I'm going to set the tone.
That's good, Lance. All right. Well, that sets up the conversation, but let's move forward because I want to unpack a little bit more on both sides of the conversation we're having today. So the second thing we want to focus on is addressing those top performance challenges. Let's just look at some practical application. There are some teams, they're sensing that dysfunction. And it's not around the health side, it's around performance. They're not getting the performance that they're looking for. And so, Amy, I want to start with you. What do you see to be one of the biggest issues when creating performance challenges in churches?
Well, there's many, but if I had to choose, the headline was just really lack of clarity around what the wins are, what the goals are. And I often see this actually organizationally. Organizationally, they don't really know what they're working towards. And so what a win looks like for the organization. And then if that's fuzzy, then how do you get personal performance, designated out as well? And so it sounds really basic, but it's a big challenge. And how that plays into performance is that there's so many good things the church can do, right? So there's so many different things that they could get involved in. And when goals aren't clear, what people do on staff is they just kind of get busy taking care of things. And so they'll do what they think they should be doing. And then pretty soon, everyone's pulling in different directions. They're not pulling together. And without that organizational clarity, with priorities being clear, the church just loses momentum. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest headlines, is that they don't know what they're doing and nobody's really managing that.
Yeah, that's good. So Lance, related to that, you can't even give them wins without clarifying your goals and strategy. Churches tend to stop at the goals though. So for example, we want to increase our discipleship attendance. If they set any at all, it's just a challenge for them. So the big picture of where we want to go, that's clear. But the strategy for how to get there seems to be some fuzziness there. Are you seeing that?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think sometimes it's systemic for the organization, but even when an organization has a clearly stated mission or vision statement and maybe some high-level goals, where I see the ball sometimes get dropped is it never gets translated into the individual team level. Like, how do we take organizational goals and how do we flesh that out at a team level? And then for the team supervisor, what does that look like at an individual level? And so expectations aren't clear. People aren't clear about their priorities and where their energy should be going. And so they just kind of make it up the best they know how. I remember about a year ago, I was at a church in Tampa, and I was speaking about the issue of priorities. And so I asked people to write down their top 3 priorities for the next 30 days. And so one of the guys in the room was a supervisor, and he not only wrote down his priorities, but he wrote down what he thought should be the top 3 priorities of all the staff he was managing. And then he had a one-on-one with each of those people, and he compared lists. And he wrote me an email later, and he said, I was absolutely shocked how different our lists were. And he says, it wasn't their fault. It was my fault. And I just think it's a powerful illustration of how the ball gets dropped at sort of that team level. And so as a team and at the individual level, we have to set clear expectations. And it's unfair to hold people accountable to performance and expectations when the priorities haven't been clearly defined. So, but once they are clear, then I think we have every reasonable chance to hold people accountable for delivering on those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've working with a larger church here in the last number of months, and I think every ministry area, they're just operating with their focus on what needs to happen in their ministry.
Yeah.
And what happens in larger churches is you tend to lose sight of the larger objectives that the church is trying to accomplish. And so if I were to assess each of the individual ministry areas, it would, like, they're doing a fabulous job in their ministry area.
Right.
But the problem is there wasn't any alignment around goals and strategies of the broader ministry objectives that the church was trying to accomplish. Amy, a third issue that we run into related to this, it has to do with leadership development, and it's really creating problems around performance. So can you talk about developing leaders based on roles and leadership capacity?
Sure. You know, if any of the churches we work with are listening, they've probably heard me say this, but again, leadership capacity is a real thing. We all have different levels of it, and we don't have the same capacity across the board. I think, you know, maybe Lance and Tony, you'd agree. I think after over 20 years of the Global Leadership Summit, maybe has created a belief within the church that we all have the spiritual gift of leadership. And I just don't think that's true. Just like we're not all teachers and shepherds at a high degree. Those are all gifts that are given to us. And so when it comes to leading other people and leading other leaders, I've just seen way too many examples of people being promoted in leadership roles beyond their gifting. So back to your question, how is this issue of leadership development affecting performance issues? It's that we place leaders in leadership roles that are not developed at that level, and they're conducting a team that they lead, but they aren't leading. They're probably still doing a lot of doing. So instead of giving ministry away and raising up the next level of leaders, they're really, a big portion of their time is spent heads down, still checking off boxes and doing things, themselves. So we need to be clear with emerging leaders where they are in their leadership development. And we need to give appropriate stretch challenges, assignments that will develop them. And we talk about that a lot. You know, give them some budget, give them a stretch goal, and then reward the right things. And so, for example, again, if you're trying to raise up a leader, make sure you're rewarding them for engaging other people, other lay leaders in the project, and don't reward for all the things that they individually, do.
That's good. Let me toss in, this is kind of like a bonus related to team performance. If you want to improve the performance of your team, stop having bad meetings. And if you wonder what does it look like to have good meetings, Amy and I actually recorded a podcast, and we kind of provided a formula on what good, healthy meetings should look like. And what we'll do is we'll include a link to that podcast in the email that you'll get after this webinar. And I really do encourage you, take the time, listen to that. It will certainly help the performance of your team as well. And actually, it may improve the health of your team. But on that note, let's shift gears and talk about the other side of this equation. The point number 3 we want to make is all around addressing the top health challenges that churches are facing. And so we've invested a bit of time talking about the performance side. We want teams to be high performing, but also for a team to have the greatest impact, it needs to be healthy as well. And so, Lance, what's the first thing that a pastor needs to do when they recognize there are unhealthy behaviors on their team?
Well, this might feel like a counterintuitive response, but I think the first thing you need to do is do some personal reflection and to ask the question, do I need to own part of this problem? And I have a story I really don't like to tell, but maybe it illustrates this. I had a guy that was on my staff 20 years ago, and we have kept in touch a lot, but he was coming through town, and he said, "Hey, can we have lunch?" And I said, "Sure." So we were reminiscing, telling old stories, laughing a lot. And then at one point in the meal, he kind of stopped and he said, "Hey, there's always something I've wanted to talk to you about." And I'm thinking, oh, great, this is not going to be good. And he said, the truth is you weren't very easy to work for. And I just listened, and it was hard to hear, but the truth is he was right. And some of the challenges that we had as a staff had to do with some of my own baggage, lack of emotional health, lack of self-awareness. And so I think as a senior leader, you got to start by kind of looking in the mirror. But then beyond that, I would say these words: engage, don't retreat. Start asking questions. Start having some honest conversations about the issues that you're seeing. Try to discern what's really going on underneath that unhealthy behavior. And I would encourage you as a leader, if you're seeing unhealthy behavior going on in the staff level, go into detective mode. Because what you may find is that there's some underlying stuff, like something might be going on at home or in a marriage completely outside of church that's prompting the unhealthy behavior. Or it could be, you know what, this person doesn't really know what the win is for their role and doesn't have clear expectations. Or it might be that they just lack, any kind of self-awareness. And so I think you want to start digging in. And I think that the hope is, we use hope as a strategy, right? Like, I'm hopeful that this is just going to go away and get better. And as we all know, hope is not a good strategy. And so I think, again, you have to sort of, buckle up and just say, you know what, I'm going to dig in and start. And by the way, much better to start dealing with it now than 6 months from now. So.
Yeah, I just had another conversation with a pastor just in the last weeks here, and they, for 2 years, were hoping that a health challenge on their team would rectify itself, and it just didn't happen. And 2 years is too long to let something that's unhealthy fester on your team. Your pointed challenge, though, that leaders need, if they see some unhealthy behavior, they need to first look in the mirror. It reminds me of the very public conversation I had with Kerry Newhoff on his podcast about my cynicism. And I'm wondering if some of that has been caught by the rest of the team. Let's move on. Amy, Amy, what are some of the top health challenges that you're seeing as you engage with church teams?
Well, Lance alluded to it earlier, but there's just too much nice and keep the peace. There isn't any hard conversations happening. So instead of talking about the real issues that are getting in the way of us having a healthy team and a healthy relationship, we choose what I call pseudo community, which is keep the peace. And, I talk about the wheel a lot. We talk about, if you're on the pace, the fast pace, slow pace, get stuff done side or the people side. The truth is, most churches, if not every church I've worked with, the majority of the staff fall on the people side. And I think that's really normal because a lot of us go into ministry because we love and care about people. But of course, the challenge is we don't like to disrupt relationships. And so we tend to be people who avoid hard conversations. And the truth is, when we don't move in on those conversations, especially if we're a supervisor, we're actually hurting that person. And so, me, Tony, I'm on the relational side of the wheel. And I remember when I would lead my team, when I had a hard conversation to have, I actually had to discipline myself to have those conversations. And the first thing I had to do was confirm my motivation for the conversation, that it was to help someone, not to hurt someone, help someone, not hurt someone. Because if it's in their blind spot and I see it as their supervisor, it's kind of my job to move in. So I would actually then write out what I needed to say, believe it or not. Yeah. I had to go pen to paper and again, get my right motivation. Remember, it's my responsibility to have this conversation. I'm for them, not against them, but write out what I needed to say, because here's what would happen. I get someone across the table from me, by the way, who I really enjoy working with, but they have a blind spot. And as soon as I would start talking, I would just feel my words hitting them. And then I tried to comfort them like at the same time. So if you can imagine that loop that's going on. And if I didn't discipline myself, I'm sure they would walk away not having any idea what I just said because I talked in circles. But I'd write it out. And actually in some of the really hard ones early on, I would say, I'm actually going to read this because I want to make sure I'm really clear what I'm sharing with you. And then I would give them a copy of it. Now I got better at it over time. But as the leader, one of my swing thoughts always is you get what you tolerate. And so when you see those blind spots, it's your role to move in. And when churches are not strong on this health side, we've just been really nice for many years, but we really have a lot of issues that are not being talked about and talked through.
Swing thoughts. Amy, you're admitting that you've played golf.
I do. I actually golfed this week.
Oh, good for you. Well,
first time this year.
For those that don't play golf, can you explain what a swing thought is?
Yeah, well, my husband's my golf coach. And so when I would go to hit the ball, he was always so good at just giving me one swing thought. Pretend there's a towel under your arm, and then I'd swing and I'd hit the ball miraculously. But if he were to say, put the towel under your arm, keep your nose over the ball, put your weight on your front feet, like I would never have hit the ball. And so I just use that swing thought in those moments like that. Like, what's the one thing I want to remember as I'm going into
Right.
the conversation?
That's good. That's good. All right. So related to that, Lance, this is probably not going to be a surprise to you, but in most churches, there's not a lot of good resolution to conflict. And so I'm hoping you can share your wisdom on how we can approach conflict in a healthier way.
Well, actually, I'm still trying to get over Jason being Amy's coach. Speaking of conflict, if I was Connie's golf coach, that would cause a lot of conflict. So that's very impressive that you guys can pull that off. So, but I think to lean into what Amy was already saying, I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge this is an area of struggle for most of us in ministry. We don't naturally do this very well, and it does bother us. And there's a lot of angst around dealing with conflict. And in fact, if you don't have any of that, I'm not sure you're probably wired really to be in church ministry, but I'm a big fan of Patrick Lencioni. And one of the things he talks about in this issue of avoiding conflict, he says, the number one organization that struggles with this the most is churches. And he said, it's because we have this misguided idea that it's not okay to be disagreeable, or it's not okay to get frustrated with each other. And so we play nice and then just, take care of all the messy stuff offline. And I guess the main thing I would want to say to a person or a church is, this is a skill we can learn and we must learn. And I love how granular Amy's illustration was of the steps she had to walk through. And that's a skill. And so I think, again, what we have to do is lean in, because it's right. And I have, in all these years of ministry experience, I've just seen how much dysfunction and chaos I've created because of my lack of skill in this area. And so I would say, if you want to get better at this, let me give you a couple of ideas. One is read some good books. There's some great books out there these days, Crucial Conversations. I'm a big fan of Susan Scott's book, Fierce Conversations. I wrote 2 chapters in my newest book, High Impact Teams, on how to have uncomfortable conversations. And in it, I got very tactical on the steps you can take, because I feel like that's often where things end up getting a little bit messy. And so I think we've got to learn how to attack issues without attacking each other. And we could obviously spend all day talking about this, but let me give you, leaders, one other kind of just personal encouragement. And that is, keep short accounts when it comes to this. One of my biggest mistakes as a leader has been waiting too long to sit down and have a clear, mature, adult, honest conversation about a problem. And so kind of one of my mantras I've been carrying the last few years is, I have to learn the skill of being both clear and kind. And I can do both.
That's good, Lance. All right. I want to come right back to you, because there seems to be one other big topic related to team health that I know churches want to talk about, but many times they don't do anything about it. Yeah. It has to do with this issue of work-life balance. So can you give us some perspective on what we need to be sensitive to when it comes to that topic?
Yeah, one of the things that quickly comes to my mind is, every church I know would go, well, of course I want everybody's family to be healthy and have adequate time off and whatever, but often their culture and even their systems kind of work against that. But I remember one time I was doing a pastor's retreat, and I was teaching on Sabbath. And at the end of my talk on Sabbath, one of the pastors said, and I appreciated his honesty, because he was really candid. He said, if I'm honest, I try to keep people like you away from my staff. He said, because I don't want my underperforming staff to have another excuse not to get their job done. And so I said, you know what, I really appreciate your honesty, because I have felt that sometimes from pastors when I've talked on that. But I said, what if we adopted a both and approach, where we really valued hard work and producing results? And that's a stewardship issue, certainly. But how about also if we just as much cared about people's pace and time and family and personal health? And so again, I've been talking a lot about, let's teach people how to work really hard, but then also unplug really hard. I really do believe that the greatest gift any of us give our teams is a healthy us. When my marriage is strong and I'm feeling connected to my kids and I'm walking with Jesus and I'm not running on empty and I have some hobbies and recreation, I'm a better staff member. And I think for me, Tony, one of the big messages is that health has everything to do with high performance. They're not disconnected. They really are. And I'll tell you this one little story. I was in Florida in a room with Mark Miller, who's a VP for Chick-fil-A. And there were a couple hundred pastors in the room. And at the end of his talk, he said, when you were born, God gave every one of you a palette of colors with which to paint a rich life. He said, you know what my problem is with you pastors? You only paint with one color, the ministry color. And he said, you need some things outside of your ministry and your job that build richness and texture to your life. And he said, and by the way, when you have that, you'll actually be a better pastor.
That's good.
Mark should be pastoring.
Yeah,
you really should.
All right. Well, let's kind of tie a bow on this as best we can today. We've talked about both health and high performance. In fact, if you're still clueless, what's the bottom line on this? We at the Unstuck group really think you need to be paying attention to both. It's not going to be helpful for you and your team to only focus on doing ministry and having healthy relationships and loving on each other and encouraging each other, but not getting anything done when it comes to the mission God's called us to. But on the other side, it's not good to have a healthy, thriving, mission-focused church that's making a great kingdom impact, and for the team to be falling apart when it comes to how they're doing life together, and for you as leaders not to be in a healthy place, as Lance was just alluding to. So I know this is a challenge, but this brings us to the fourth section of our webinar today. It's all about the first steps that we want to encourage you to take. And so, Lance, I want to begin with you here. Where do we start? If we want to have both a healthy and a high-performing team, where do we begin?
Well, I think the first place to begin, honestly, is just to acknowledge that this is an area where we need to put some energy and some leadership, and we need to develop and get better, because often, I think as senior leaders, we're almost acting like nothing's really going on, but down in the organization, people feel it. They feel the lack of health. They feel the toxicity. They feel the exhaustion. And I remember Michael Abrashoff, who wrote a great leadership book called It's Your Ship. He was a 4-star admiral in the Navy. And one of his statements he made, I've always remembered, was, your people always know the score even when you don't want them to. Like they feel it. And I think part of good leadership is just acknowledging, like, hey, we want to get better. And for some of you, it might be, we're a good team, but we want to become a world-class team. For some of us, it's kind of sobering to realize we maybe really have a lot of work to do, and we've got some lack of health or lack of performance. And I think just acknowledging is a good first step. And then the second one I would say is just lean in. You're not going to drift into becoming a healthy and high-performing team. And again, I think you've got to do some assessment, and we're working to provide that kind of thing at the Unstuck group. But it's not so important where you are today. What's more important is, can you move the needle in health and high performance in the next few months? And I would just say to you, you got to take a long-term approach here. There's no quick fix. There's no magic bullet in this. It's some hard work, and it's going to take some time. I would also say a great step is to get everybody on your senior leadership, making sure that you're working on your own emotional health. You got to go to school on yourself and on your culture, and you've got to become a student of your own soul. And I think even also to realize, apart from that, most of us weren't trained how to effectively lead teams, how to, do performance management. We weren't trained for that. So we're going to have to go to school and become a student of this area. And our churches are going to be better if we're willing to do that.
That's good. All right, Amy, I want you to speak directly to the senior pastors, because if I'm in the seat of a senior pastor right now, I'm hearing, oh my goodness, I have to lead both the performance side of what's happening in our organization and what's happening with the health of the organization. Is that possible for the senior pastor to be driving both of those?
Well, I think I just read the book Extreme Ownership by the two Navy SEALs. And so part of me goes, you have to own
Gosh,
it.
now I feel like I need to read a book by an admiral or something
I
after
know,
those
I
two
know.
references.
So I think you have to own it, but do you have to lead it? I would say the best way for a senior pastor to lead this is to build a senior leadership team that is committed to both of those things. We're big around here on team-based leadership. There is an owner, there is a leader, but as much as this that we can do by team is best. And I think a healthy senior leadership team should obviously keep their eyes on the results of the entire organization, right? Is our front door healthy? Are we reaching new people? Are people taking steps along the discipleship path? There's ways to measure that and to take a look at that. And right, Lance? And the leadership team should be committed to leading a spiritually vibrant organization. So they should model health by taking their Sabbath and taking time off, those things that you just talked about, Lance. They should, at the right time, be in the Word with their teams. They should have regular one-on-ones that address more than performance, but to understand how their staff is doing. And of course, when that leadership team models those things so well, they're teaching their people how to continue that throughout the organization. So having said that, there are often people on the leadership team who have a bent towards one or the other. It's a rare person who's got the wiring to keep their eye fully on both of those things. So to cover the bases, I think it's okay to name a champion, someone who's really great at making sure we're getting those performance, topics looked at. We've got a dashboard. We're keeping our eye on the ball there. And to have someone else who's more, attuned to that health side. So again, the team owns it, but having some champions will make sure that you don't tip too far one way or the other.
That's good. Lance, any final thoughts as we wrap up and move to Q&A?
Well, I think first off, the intentionality to make sure that you're going to go after both. Like Amy said, you may not have the wiring to really, lead one side or the other, but I think as senior leaders to go, we're committed to nothing less than being absolutely healthy and also high performing. And so to put a stake in the ground that you're going to go after both. But the kind of final thought I would have is think about your church budget. I know we all love to do that. I had my quiet time out of our church's budget this morning, but think about your church budget. In almost every church I've ever known, the single biggest line item is personnel. We're investing more resources, more dollars, in the staff that we hire, and the stakes are incredibly high with your team. And I think we all intuitively feel this, but I just want to articulate it for us. Your church's kingdom impact is absolutely and directly tied to your ability to build a healthy and high-performing team. You're not going to get after the mission and vision that God's giving you if the team is a shambles, or if there's toxicity, or all your sideways energy is spent on managing dysfunction. But you're also not going to really be all that God wants you to be if, man, you are goal-driven and hard driving, but you crush your team in the process. And we're people in the church that we're both about the means and the ends. It's both. It's getting after the end goal of the Great Commission, but also how we do it and how we do it with our team really matters. And so I think all of this topic, it's very much tied to how much we're going to be able to impact our communities.
That's great. So I had two thoughts as I was listening to this. First of all, in case anybody's wondering, you're listening to this conversation, Amy and Lance, they're not just talking about what it is to be high performers and healthy. They live this out themselves. They model this. And so my first thought was, thank you for being a part of our team at the Unstuck group, because I'm so grateful for your contribution on both sides of this ledger. My second thought was, I'm going to have to pay you both a lot more because everybody listening today is going to want you to be on their team as well. So there you go. But with that, Lance is too humble to suggest this as a first step as well. But his book, High Impact Teams, it's all about this topic that we're addressing today. And I would just challenge you, if I were in your shoes, I did this with my team. I bought everybody a copy. I would do that with your team. Buy everybody a copy and process Lance's writing on both of these issues, performance and health, with your team. I think that would be the best first step that you can take. Some of you are probably thinking, yeah, that's great, but we're going to need some additional help, whether that's assessing where we are in our team. Is it more of a performance issue? Is it more of a health issue? We could use some direct coaching, helping us move forward in both of these areas. And all I can say is, that's good, because we're going to be helping you with that. But we don't have specific details on that for you today. But we're in the process of developing some great resources that will help you in this area. And what we'll do in the email that will come out after the webinar, we'll offer an opportunity for you to be on our email list, so that when those resources are released in the coming months, you can also take advantage of those opportunities. Now, this is my favorite part of these webinars. It's the Q&A, not only because we get to answer the questions that are coming in from people that are watching and listening, but I get to pick the hardest questions and decide, is Amy going to answer them or is Lance going to answer them?
I'll be having some technical problems if you throw a hard one my way.
All right, Lance, this first one's for you. If we're so focused on execution, how do you even begin to carve out time to focus on relationship? And what does it look like if you know you are organizationally not good at this?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things come to mind. I think one is, you're right. You can't, I think one of the fears in hearing a webinar like this is you're going, oh my gosh, all this stuff that we've got to add in now. And so I'm thinking, like, start with the simple step of figuring out how can you use your already meeting rhythm that you have and begin to integrate some of that into it. Like maybe take 10 or 15 minutes and spend a little time in the Word together, or start, having a question every week where you guys can really get to know each other better. And one of the teams I served on, we did that. We front loaded that at the end of the meeting so it wouldn't get cut out. And I remember times when we laughed so hard we fell off our chairs, cried together. And so we didn't add a new thing. We just integrated it into something that we were already doing. And if you're not naturally good at this, I think a great first step is start reading some books that are around soul care. Pick up John Ortberg's book, Soul Keeping, or Pete Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, or I've got the book Replenish that, some of you might want to pick up. So I would say that's been extremely helpful for me. Just start immersing myself in some content that's helpful in this area.
All right, Amy, this is a hardball question for you. Are you ready?
Well, Lance did so good. I think you should throw him another one. First webinar with us.
No, you've got this. How can a staff person have open and honest conversations with their senior leadership about the unhealthy behavior within the staff?
Yeah, that is far too common. I go back a little bit with, first, check your motivation. Really understand why you want to raise that issue, and think through, give yourself some time to pray through and think through, what are the right words to tell that story? How do you create a word picture that they can hear and listen to? Because you're going to be leading up. And if you want to influence the leaders above you, they have to know that you're on board with them, that you're with them, that you know what matters to them. And so, in fact, John Maxwell's book, 360-Degree Leader, has some great tools to help coach. How do you approach those difficult conversations? But once you do that homework, schedule the time and have the crucial conversation. I do believe if your motivation's right, if you've prayed through that and you've been very respectful in how you bring it up and you've aligned yourself with those leaders' hearts, I believe that they'll hear you. And then at least you will have done your part for the sake of the organization to raise those issues. I don't know, Lance, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think, just to acknowledge it is risky when enter, especially if maybe that leader's maybe got some insecurities and can be easily become defensive. So I think you just got to acknowledge, like, yeah, that is risky, but sometimes, in order to do what's right for the health of the organization, I have to do that. Another thing I would just coach is just really choose your words carefully. Don't make accusations. I like leading with things like, here's my observations, or here's my concern. That way it's what I'm observing. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm starting with just what my perception is. And I think that opens a door for a more gentle conversation.
I just think it's funny that you said if a leader has securities. Have you ever known a leader that didn't have insecurities, Lance?
No.
Okay.
We all have them. They just come out in different ways, right?
All right, Amy, you actually referred to some of the complexity that multi-site creates when it comes to health and performance. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that, and what are some of the kind of the key steps that multi-site churches need to keep in mind when it comes to this topic?
Sure. Well, the things that you need to work on if you're on the leadership team of a multi-site church is going back to establishing clarity for the team members. People need to know what they own, what they're responsible for. And it's our ongoing joke this month, Tony. How do you starve a dog? You remember the punchline? How do you starve a dog?
Assign 8 people to feed it.
That's right. So good job. If everybody feels like they own something, really nobody does. And for leaders underneath you, if you're on the senior leadership team, that can be really frustrating. And so now they're stepping on each other's, feet. And anyways, you have to make that clear. Beyond that kind of complexity, once you've made that clarity, you've got to find the right intersections for the team members to cross paths. You can't just wait for happenstance for that to happen. We have to think through who needs to cross paths, who needs to be in what conversations, whose voice do we need on certain decisions. And when that intentionality is in place, I see, at least I would say on the health side, you've got more relational capital built in so that when there are problems, we don't assume the worst. We've got some trust built in the people who are impacted by decisions. And on the performance side, when you've got those strategic intersections, then you're at least understanding what everyone's working on and where we're going and who's owning things. So I don't know, did that get at the heart of the question, Tony? Those are some of the multi-site things that I see. That's
good, Amy. All right, Lance, I think this one's for you. You've actually been a senior pastor, so you have experience being seated in that chair, but also working for senior pastors. So here it is. Our senior pastor is nice, in quotes. He or she avoids conflict. Our staff, though, is going all over the place. We know there's no direction. How do we lead up in that situation?
I'm having technical problems. I couldn't hear the question. Yeah. And I think, so I'm just going to be really candid. A couple of things come to my mind. One is, you are limited in, kind of what you can control if you're not the senior leader. So I think there's 2 things I would focus on. Number 1 is lead your area really strongly and well with both health and high performance. So even though you may not control the whole organization, I think you can make sure your area is strong. And then secondly, I think try to get your senior leader to be open to being exposed to some, books and resources, some podcasts that will help them begin to maybe engage the performance side that doesn't come naturally for them. And again, I think you have to take a long-term approach here and realize that at the end of the day, there's certain things that you just don't control in this. But I do think you can influence, and I would put strategic resources in their hands and hope that the Holy Spirit uses that to prompt the leader to engage it.
And this is going to sound like the churchy answer too, but whenever I see a question like that, I always want to remind folks, the first thing you really ought to do is pray for your pastor.
That's
Mhm.
good.
Because the honest, I mean, if they're like me and the leadership responsibilities I've had in the past, it's like, I've never done this before. I'm trying to figure it out. And I want my team to make a big impact, and I want people to love working on the team too, but I've never done this before. And
Mhm.
so it would just, if I knew someone on my team were feeling something along those lines, yes, I would want them to communicate that and engage that conversation. But I would want to know that they were also praying for me, because I'm doing something I've never done before.
Mhm.
So
And
again, a churchy answer, but
can I add one thing? I
yeah,
think just to
yeah.
realize too, whatever you say, you're poking around on that person's insecurities,
Mm-hmm.
and to be sensitive to that. I'm insecure. That senior leader may project a lot of confidence, but they do have some insecurities. And so
Yeah.
you want to approach it with gentleness and kindness.
Lance, I think that's going to be your next book. Every leader is insecure, and you just go from there. Okay. Amy, this is kind of the reverse question, and I'm going to let you take this one. Let me put my glasses on so I can actually read the question. We've had a culture of being tight. We're a family. We're a relational staff. How do we make that hard shift to becoming more focused on performance and bringing more balance?
Good question. Well, I think, again, when you get clear on what you're trying to do as an organization, those goals aren't good or bad, and your strategies are maybe effective or not effective. I think we have to take some of the personal feel out of this. You hear me say this all the time, Tony. How you try to accomplish your goals, that's a strategy. And so as employees, we need to be adapting our strategies to get different results. And if you approach it, as Lance said earlier, this isn't personal. We're not attacking a person when we have hard conversations around lack of performance or things not working. We're honestly often attacking a strategy. And so it's hard to get that when you've been very family-esque in how you've approached the work. It's hard to change, but I think if you start with clearly identifying what people need to be doing, and then start taking that approach to hold people accountable. And again, we all locked arms, we all agreed this is where we're heading, and to not make it personal, but to make it about the strategies that you're working on. I think that's a first step. I love Nancy Beach on this one. When I was working full time, she was at Willow Creek, and I remember she goes, I always choose community. It's harder when things go wrong, but if I were to tip one way or the other way, I tip towards community versus transactional business relationships. And I guess that's what I've always done too. It is hard when there's some lack of, community that gets broken. But I often encourage people, choose that way, do the best you can, but you've got to still be a leader and you've still got to lead towards results.
Couldn't agree more. In fact, I was at a conference many, many years ago. Thousands of leaders gathered, and basically the speaker was saying, if you're the leader of the organization, you can't be friends with the people that you're leading.
Mm-hmm.
And the people around me, I was jumping out of my chair. That's wrong. You can't do that. And Lance and Amy, I appreciate the fact that you're bringing it back full circle from that thought to, no, really, we can do life together. We can enjoy life together. We can be an encouragement to each other to live in a healthy way, how we engage life and our ministry together. And at the same time, we can accomplish something significant. So thank you again for being a part of our conversation today. And thank you all too for listening in, watching. Amy and Lance offered a lot of resources. They referenced a lot of resources during today's conversation. Our promise to you is in the email we send out, we'll list all those resources so that you can go back and refer to them. And then there were a number of questions that we did not get to as well, and we will respond to those later. In fact, you can keep submitting questions either in social media by using hashtag UnstuckChurch, or by emailing us at help@theunstuckgroup.com. And just out of curiosity, Amy, do you know what state you're going to next to help a church?
Let's see. I am heading to Modesto, California.
Modesto. And Lance, do you know where you're going next to help a church?
Actually, yeah, it's kind of funny because I'm also going to Modesto, but I don't know that I'm going to the
It's a
same
different church. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just got back from Fort Worth, but all that to say, our team is helping churches across the country, and we really want to come alongside your church as well. So no matter your shape or size, if you're single location, multi-site, whatever the case might be, we want to help your church have a greater impact. And so please reach out to us. We'd love to start a conversation. Obviously, you can begin that by going to theunstuckgroup.com. Let's start that conversation and talk about how our team can come alongside your team to help you have a greater kingdom impact. We'll look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. Have a great day.